Hey guys, it's Eric, owner of Farpoint Farms here in the mountains of North Carolina. Tonight we're going to talk about base station antennas. Specifically, we're going to talk about cheaper base station antennas. So we're going to stay away from like the Antrons, the Solarcons, and the IMAXs, and the Matgos, and the Elements, and the Beams, and all those crazy things. We'll make another video that covers like, base station antennas. But what we're going to talk about tonight is low-end base station antennas, cheap ones, because a lot of people get into the hobby don't want to drop like $150 on an antenna and some wire and stuff like that. So we'll go through some options that are out there, and I'll tell you what my pick would be for a good cheap base station antenna. And by cheap, I mean, less than 50 bucks. So let's get started. But first, let me show you what you can't do as far as cheap base station antennas go, okay? So that's what you can't do. You can't just take a mobile antenna and stick it on your roof of your house. It just won't work. And the reason it won't work is it doesn't have a ground plane. Your car, a giant piece of metal, acts as a ground plane for those short antennas, quarter wave antennas, and it needs that in order for the signal to work right. So you'll have an extremely high SWR, and even if you don't, you'll have a pretty crummy transmit and receive because it just won't be set up right. So that takes us back to where we are right now. Let's see what we can do to get a decent base station antenna. Now, I get a lot of messages first about what we just covered. That, hey, why doesn't my 4-foot fire stick work very well hanging off my gutter of my house? All right. Well, now we know why, right? It just doesn't. It's not meant for it. It doesn't have a ground plane. But there are antennas out there that are very inexpensive that can work as a base station antenna. Those would be antennas that say no ground plane required. Okay. Now there's one's made for motorhomes and one's made for boats that have no ground plane requirements. Again, they're going to be awfully short. They're going to be 4 foot, 3 foot, sometimes only 2.5 feet. Not an ideal length for a base station antenna, but they will work. So if you're in an apartment or something like that, you could go out and look for an antenna that requires no ground plane for mobile use, and that should work for you at the house. That's one option. The other option, and I hear a lot about this, I don't personally own one, I've never had one, but I can tell you my worries about it, would be the Tram, I think it's the Saturn V1, right? That's a no ground plane base station antenna. It's like 39 inches long, super short. It is a base station antenna, okay? And it uses the cabling as its ground plane. So you have to have a minimum of 50 feet of cabling in order for the Workman B100 to work right. Now that's not that big a deal if you're going to put it on the second story of your house and run the cabling down through and all the rest. But for most people that are going to invest in something like that, they're using it because they live in an apartment complex and they just want it hanging outside of the window or something like that, so they only need about 10 or 12 feet of cord. Again, we run into a problem, right? We don't have enough cabling to make that work right. It's very inexpensive. You can get those for right around $30 to $40 depending on where you buy it from, plus a little bit of shipping. And I have heard that when set up perfectly, they do work okay. But let's think about this: a quarter wave, 102 inches or 109, right? That's like the minimum you would really want to have for a base station. And so the 102 steel whip that I have on the back of my truck is probably going to transmit and receive far better than that Workman will, just because of size. They take all the extra inches that you need to make that quarter or half wave, whatever's stuffed inside of that thing, and they just coil it up. And it does work. That's how they get the SWRs down, but it doesn't work very well as far as radiating goes because you only are radiating from a stick this long. That's not very good. Heck, my Tram 3500, that's like a 47 or 48 inch whip. So right there, it's already taller and longer than this little B100 base station antenna. So if I'm going to make a recommendation, and I guess I am, it's going to be to go with this. There is a way to use a mobile antenna, specifically the one I'm about to mention, and turn it into a base station and get decent results. And I know this because once upon a time, when I first got started in CB radio and ham radio and all the rest, this was my antenna, and eventually I doubled it, and then eventually I moved up to an Antron. But this is it. I took a 102 steel whip, like this one pictured here, right? And then I added to that this kit right here, and it's about 12 bucks. and that's a ground plane kit. That little star-shaped thing there, those little radials sticking out, that acts as a ground plane, just like a car would. So you take your steel whip and you screw it onto one of those ground plane kits, and now you can mount that anywhere. You can mount it hanging out the window of an apartment, or on the railing of your deck on your apartment, or at a house, or in your garage, or wherever you want to hang this thing. But now it has a ground plane, so it becomes an effective base station. Hook that to some decent quality wire, and while we're talking wire, I have some examples here. This is RG8X, which is a nice thin cabling you can see here. It's thinner than a pencil, right? Now RG8X is fine for car use. You put about 12 to 18 feet of this stuff. You're not going to have a lot of loss there. And so if you're going to keep your runs under about like 20 to 25 feet, yeah, you can probably get away with that. Get yourself some decent quality and you'll be fine. But if you're going to run more than 20 to 25 feet, or if you have the money, I highly recommend moving up to something like this, which is in comparison, I'd say about twice the thickness. So this is RG8U, which is actually extinct, but you can still find it some places. Their equivalent would be an RG213 or an LMR 400, although the LMR 400 looks like this. It's really stiff. It's hard to bend. This has got a flexible steel core in, or copper core in it, where the LMR is a solid piece. So it's a little stiffer, harder to work with. But those are your cable options there. But now back to the antenna setup. If you set that up there and then run this cabling, you ought to have a pretty good base station now. The base station I had when I first got started, first I had a mobile radio, but when I first got my unit in Washington, that was the antenna I had. I took an extra steel whip that I had, bought a ground plane kit. Back then they were $9.99, now they're about $12.99, which actually isn't bad inflation when you think about it. But ran that down with some RG8X because I couldn't afford the good stuff at that point. And lo and behold, on the side of my little mobile home, it worked pretty darn well. Eventually, I got what's called co-phasing cables and got a second setup just like that with another 102 steel whip and another ground plane kit. And I was able to make my setup a little bit directional. I was trying to reach a specific area where most of the people in the groups that I listened to were hanging out. And so I kind of set the other antenna up on the roof and gave it a radiating pattern that pointed in that direction. So that was really cool. That's kind of the subject of another video, but just to let you know, you can start off with that and say probably have, with cabling and everything, $40 invested into that. And then you could move up. Instead of getting an Antron, you could get a second one and become kind of a directional beam antenna instead of a pole antenna. So things to think about it. Right, so those are options you have for inexpensive base station antennas. Moving up, like if I was going to go with it myself, I would go with the 102 steel whip with a ground plane kit, with some good probably RG213 or LMR 400 wire to go with it. And you'd probably be really surprised at what you can hear and send and receive. Now, the Saturn V100, again, I've never owned it. People who own them do tend to say they like them, but they're limited on transmit and receive just due to their size, just the size and nature. So you can't really get around it. There's only so much you can do. So in the next video, we'll cover larger antennas like the Antron and the Solarcon and the Mako 5/8, and there's a bunch of pole antennas, the Shakespeare Big Stick, stuff like that, which are just like what I've installed here. If you've been following my videos, you know I recently put up a new tower and got a Solarcon Max 2000. Now, those antennas are what everyone really thinks of as your base antenna, and they are, but you're looking at spending about 2 to 3 times what you could set up one of those 102 steel whip base antennas for. So you have to have a bit more of an investment. And then from there, maybe we'll make a part 3, and we'll talk about the big boys, the quads, the games where you got stacked beams and you have to put them on antenna rotors, but you can now move and find the signal you want, focus in on that, and so that'll be part 3. We'll get into that. Now there is another way to get into the base station antenna hobby really cheaply, and that's to make your own antenna. And that'll be part 4, which we'll go ahead and try to make our own antenna. I've always wanted to play with making my own antenna, but we'll finally get into it. And I'm not talking about running a string from a tree. You can do that. You could run an 18-foot piece of wire from a tree, and that would also work as a base station, but again, I'll get into that later. But I'm talking about making a beam antenna. There's plans out there on the internet. As long as you cut your pipes the right size and run your wires the right way, you can have something that's just as awesome as anything you can buy on the internet. So that's kind of cool too. But That's it for tonight. I am Eric, owner of Farpoint Farms. Hope you enjoyed part 1, which is the old cheap CB base station antenna. And, well, I'll see you next time. Take care.
There's always something that needs a little fixing on Farpoint Farms. Freedom is mighty sweet. Liberty sows its seed at Farpoint.